Well, we'd like to welcome everyone for being on tonight's webinar. On behalf of the partners and consultants of Understanding Ag, we thank you for attending tonight's webinar. Dr. Alan Williams will be doing a presentation called The Tables Have Turned. Before we get started, I want to make sure you're aware, April the 14th, we will have another marketing webinar called Laying the Foundation with Dr. Williams, Gabe Brown, and myself, Shane New. Then April the 16th, another webinar, Soil Building Secrets with Ray Archuleta and David Kleinschmidt. Please, if you have any questions you'd like to ask from tonight's webinar, go to the Q&A section of the Zoom meeting at the bottom of your page and about the middle, and please type your questions in. And once Dr. Williams is done presenting, we can ask him the questions as they come in. So anyhow, without any further ado, Dr. Williams, I think everybody's excited to hear what you have to say in regards to The Tables Have Turned.
Okay, well, thank you, Shane. It's a pleasure to do this presentation this evening. Glad to have everyone on the line. I think we had an excellent group that signed up, and we will have plenty of time for questions at the end. So please type them into the chat box or the Q&A section, and we'll make sure and cover absolutely as many questions as we possibly can. All of you know that we've been through some very trying times, and those times are still with us right now with the pandemic. And they have certainly significantly and maybe permanently altered our markets, the way we approach these markets, how we strategize, and so forth. So we're going to talk about that tonight and how some of these events have potentially created a paradigm shift in the food and agriculture sector. I love this quote. Shane, I believe, was the one that shared this with us a couple of weeks ago, but it's very, very appropriate for today. And it says, in times of change, learners will inherit the earth, while the learned find themselves beautifully equipped to deal with a world that no longer exists. And I think that's really where we're at today. The world as we knew it has absolutely changed. Just how much, we don't know that yet, but it has changed. So we're going to have to become learners. And in a lot of cases, we're going to have to become fast learners. So let's look at the impacts of the coronavirus, or as it's often called, COVID-19. How has the pandemic impacted our food markets? Well, one of the things that it's definitely done is it has exposed the weak links in our centralized food system. And two of those links, we're going to talk about more of the weak links just a little in a few minutes, but two of the most glaring that have been definitively exposed over the last month or so is the transportation bottleneck. We still only have so many trucks and so many drivers, and we can only deliver food so fast. And what we have to understand is when there is a run or these panic buys on the grocery stores, no grocery store in America can stock any more than 2 to 4 days worth of food and goods with some type of significant run on that grocery store. That's it. They cannot hold any more than that. And that has put a significant strain on our transportation industry to be able to keep up and to be able to keep dry goods and food and so forth delivered to these grocery stores. We have a significant storage bottleneck as well, and that has been exposed. We have bottlenecks within our restaurants, within institutional food service, and within grocery stores, retail grocery sector, for both dry goods storage and cold storage. And the cold storage includes both refrigerated and frozen. And this has created square footage issues. In other words, restaurants and grocery stores have built themselves out so that they only have so much square footage. And because of the way that the centralized food system has trained them and oriented them, they built out their square footage over the last several decades based on being able to deliver quickly to the stores and restaurants and institutional food service. So what has happened here? Well, we have seen widespread consumer panic, resulting in panic buying, and certainly a change in buying habits pre-COVID-19 versus post-COVID-19, or at least while we're in the midst of COVID-19. This has created uncertainty in the minds of consumers about the food system and the availability of that food and other goods. And we're discovering that fear breeds fear. When the consumer is fearful, then they make panic buys. They see bare shelves, that prods them into greater fear to do even more panic buying. And that's exactly what we have seen in many, many different regions around the country. Now, a lot of this panic buying on food has been in spite of the fact, and I don't know how many of you out there tonight know this, but in just our frozen food stocks alone, not our normal fresh food supply, that, by the way, is still being produced. But in frozen food stocks, this is excess stocks of food. And this includes vegetables, frozen fruits, meats, cheeses, dairy products, and so forth. We currently have a little more than 8.1 billion pounds of frozen food stocks. So we're not running out of food, or at least not yet, but yet we have a lot of bare grocery store shelves, and we have a lot of panic buying by the consumer. So the consumer, instead of seeing this, what you're seeing on the left-hand side of the screen, a well-stocked meat counter, they're seeing what you see on the right-hand side of the screen, just a handful of items in that meat counter. So what has happened here? Well, due to the centralization of our food system, we have created what is known as just-in-time delivery. And this just-in-time delivery that has worked so well over the last several decades has trained retail grocers, restaurants, and institutional food service quite well. They have been able to pick up a phone, place an order, and a truck shows up in the next day or two. And it always happens. We may have had interruptions very locally here and there if we had a significant flood, we had a tornado, hurricane, something like that. But this is the first time in a very long time that people in America have experienced a nationwide issue such as this. So this just-in-time delivery has encouraged, again, all of these sectors, the grocers, the restaurants, institutional food service, to build out their entire systems of production, sales, storage capacity, inventory management, and everything else on just-in-time delivery. Well, here's the deal. Just-in-time delivery is only good if it works, just like a computer. All of you are on a computer tonight accessing this webinar, or maybe not, because if your computer's not working, you're not on tonight. And if a computer's not working, all it is a very large and expensive paperweight, nothing more. And we're discovering that just-in-time delivery is a very large paperweight on the ability to be able to get food adequately and properly distributed across the U.S. when we have consumers reacting like they're reacting today. So the fact is, there are serious flaws in our food system. Cheap transport combined with global supply networks have often masked those flaws, and they've done it for quite some time. But now is the time to recognize those flaws and to start to do the things that we need to do to fix our food system. Just like we work at building resilience in our soil and on our farms, we've got to work at building resilience into our food system. And to do that, we're first going to have to reduce our reliance. I didn't say eliminate our reliance, but reduce our reliance on the global supply chains. Most food products today have to travel an average of 1,400 plus miles before they get to the end consumer. And again, that's a product of the centralized food system. One of the other issues that we have with this centralized food system is that these systems are far less alert to what is often needed on a local basis. The other thing that we have to realize is that many of our large food companies today are not just US companies. They may have been founded here, but the vast majority of them are now global companies. And that means they source their products from many different countries. And often this allows them to mask to the consumer price volatility in things like crop failures that may happen in any one region of the US or anywhere else in the world, because they're buying globally. So in the event of being able to buy globally, they can often mask price volatility and in production failures. So basically, the longer the supply chain, and that's what we've created, a very long supply chain. The longer the supply chain, the more vulnerable it is to issues like our current pandemic, the more vulnerable it is to biosecurity issues, to bioterrorism, to food safety, and numerous other challenges. As a scientist, I can tell you that in spite of the fact that we, as farmers and as vertically integrated companies and so on and so forth, implement and institute biosecurity measures, there is no such thing and never will be a such thing as 100% biosecurity. That's impossible. You can't do it. And the more concentrated operations become, the harder it is to have true biosecurity. Just like in a surgical room, it's impossible to have 100% sterility. People still get infected due to surgery, and they always will. So we've got to understand that nothing is 100%, and there's no measures that we can ever put in that are 100%. And oh, by the way, neither can we with food safety. Back in the 1980s, I was, one of the things that I did as a professor at the university, I was director of the university meat research laboratory. And at that point in time, the USDA was just starting to research and implement on a trial basis what we know as HACCP today, Hazard Analysis and Critical Control Points. And HACCP has become very commonplace in all processing plants today. Everybody has to have their HACCP plan for food safety. And what I can tell you is that having been through that in those early stages and in the research of HACCP and being involved with processing plants, particularly meat processing plants, all the way from that point all the way through today, HACCP has not been the success that it was touted to be. we still have recalls every single day. We have not done away with recalls, and many of those recalls are still massive in nature. So as much as we like to tout our food safety and say that, okay, larger plants have better food safety and these types of things, I'm just afraid that that's not quite so, folks. It's not so. And many years ago, I was a USDA food safety inspector, meat and poultry inspector. So I did inspection in quite a few plants. That was before I became a professor at the university. And what I can tell you with that is that oftentimes the smaller plants actually had far better cleanliness than many of the larger plants. So what are some of the other potential significant bottlenecks that we see and that can occur? Well, one that we may not even think about, but is quite obvious, is the Panama Canal. You know, that's our quick route between the Pacific Ocean and the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic. And yet it's a very, very small canal in the scheme of things and can only handle so much traffic. And if anything happens there, we've got a significant bottleneck at being able to deliver global goods and global food supply. In North America, just like our roads and our bridges, we have crumbling roads and bridges all over North America today. We also have crumbling locks and dams that are in significant need of overhaul. And because of that, many of our goods travel by water as much as they can, and then they go on a truck. So if we have more issues on these locks and dams on our waterways across North America, we have significant bottlenecks in being able to deliver food to people. If we have significant ongoing drought in the Central Valley of California, we're in real trouble across most of America, because a hugely disproportionate percent of our fruits and vegetables are grown there. And we do have to face the fact today that even in the farming community, we can be a bottleneck ourselves, because today many farmers grow commodities rather than food. And we're going to talk just a little bit more about that in a moment. The retail food dollar, however, returns less than 14% of that dollar to the farmer today. This creates an indirect bottleneck. Farm bankruptcies have increased dramatically year over year for the last 3 years. And what we're being told by a lot of lenders is that we're going to see the same trend here in 2020 and probably 2021. That creates a potential bottleneck. There's bottlenecks built in to our packing plants, our processors, the very business models that they have developed and utilized to design their plants, the flow of their plants, the capacity of their plants, means that they have a very hard time being flexible. So if they need to respond and react to a differing food system, a differing consumer demand, it's going to be very hard and very expensive for them to do that, because they haven't built in a lot of flexibility in these plants. And if we look at grains, we see a number of things. First of all, we've been significantly overproducing, especially on the three primary grains: corn, soybeans, and wheat. If you go to USDA ERS data and you look at our excess stocks, you know, I did that not too long ago, and I factored it out. I took the total number of people in the world, 7.6 billion, and I factored out 2018's stock overruns on corn and soybeans. Just the overrun, okay, the excess stock of corn and soybeans, if people actually ate field corn and field beans, which we do not, okay, as field corn and field beans, they have to be in some other form before we even begin to think about eating them. But if we did, the 2018 end of year excess stocks in the US alone was enough to feed every man, woman, and child in the world, all 0.76 billion of them, a quarter a pound a day of a combination of corn and soybeans for 365 days in a row. So we've got a lot of overproduction. And currently, in the corn that is grown in the US, only about 10% of that goes to feed consumers in any kind of direct fashion. And that counts corn syrup being put in a lot of our processed foods, sweet corn, cornstarch, and so forth. So only about 10%. The other 90+% goes for ethanol production and the byproduct of DDGs and direct feeding of beef cattle, dairy cattle, pork, poultry, catfish, and so forth. So what is industry doing? If we look at the bigger agricultural industry, what are some of the things that are happening right now? Well, first of all, the ethanol industry, because they're having a hard time selling ethanol because far fewer people are driving, and they're driving far fewer miles. And obviously, we know that gas prices have been dropping like a rock. So the ethanol industry has been hit hard by this shutdown. So they're looking at the plants that are staying open and operating. They're looking at trying to shift to a lot more DDG production. Well, on the surface, that may seem good. Well, that's great. That means we still have a market for our corn with the ethanol industry, because now they can at least produce DDGs, something good out of it. But it's not that good, and here's why. We've run a lot of fatty acid analysis, and we have also run consumer taste panels, sensory panel evaluation, looking at beef, dairy, chicken, pork, and so forth that is produced by feeding a lot of DDGs in their diet as a cheap byproduct, least cost part of that ration. And here's what we have discovered in our fatty acid analysis. Omega-6 to omega-3 ratios are way out of whack. The more DDGs they're fed, the wider this ratio becomes. In feedlot beef, for instance, coming out of feedlots where these cattle have been fed high levels of DDGs, we have found that ratio can be as high as 55 to 1. Now let's put that in perspective. The American Medical Association and the American Heart Association recommends that our daily diets consist of an omega-6 to 3 ratio of 4 to 1 or less. 4 to 1 or less. The average American's diet today is 20 to 1. That's why we have so many health, or one of the reasons we have so many health issues. We're already at 20 to 1. But now we've got meats and animal proteins being produced that are way above that. 30 to 1, 40 to 1, 50 to 1 plus because of DDGs. So we have significant potential health issues and long-term health issues because of this DDG factor. Secondly, though, in the sensory panel evaluations, what we have found in evaluating foods for taste, tenderness, texture, flavor, and juiciness, that protein products coming from animals fed high levels of DDGs or even moderate levels of DDGs have very, very bland flavor profiles, and oftentimes extremely bland flavor profiles. It's harmful to the texture of meat. It produces a mushy texture rather than a nice firm bite like consumers want. And it significantly reduces juiciness. So after just 2 to 3 chews, basically the juiciness is gone. It will be like putting a piece of juicy fruit gum in your mouth, and after 2 to 3 chews, the gum turning into dry rubber. And now you're chewing on dry rubber. That's what a lot of this meat is like from animals fed high levels of DDGs. Now, because of that, if you're in the protein sector, if you produce proteins, this should be a serious and significant issue for you. And you should think hard about this, because we've got significant challenges from the plant-based protein sector. And if their product tastes better and is juicier, well, more and more consumers are going to quit buying real protein and buy plant-based proteins. And that's going to harm each and every one of us. So don't make light of this DDG issue. It can harm you in a lot of different ways. Another thing that we're having is an inversion in pricing between meat prices and live animal prices. And look no further than the beef industry to see this happening right in front of our eyes. You know, we've had significant increases in boxed beef prices and hamburger prices and all of those types of things, but we have seen significant drops in live animal prices. So the consumer is paying an increased price, while you, if you're selling live animals, are receiving a significant discount for your animals. So in other words, the consumer market is not matching up with the live animal market at all. Now, the NCBA, Sonny Perdue, a number of senators and representatives and several others are now calling for an investigation into this. Now, what'll happen here, who knows? We shall see. But there has been call for a congressional investigation into this. If you're in the dairy business, what we're seeing, particularly with many large-scale dairies, is that right now they're dumping a lot of milk. And they were already hurting, folks. It wasn't like they were making a lot of money before this happened. They were in significant financial straits ahead of this. And now they're having to dump milk. And a lot of this is due to the fact that we've had school closures and institutional food service closures all over the US. And this is in spite of the fact that milk has been hard to find on a lot of grocery store shelves. Now, the other thing that we're starting to see, and I was wondering when, I knew this would happen, I was just wondering the timing of it. But we're starting to see processing plants closing or under threat to close due to COVID-19 cases among their workers. JBS, the largest packer in the US and largest packer in the world, has seen a significant increase in many of their plants here in the US of COVID-19 cases increasing. They're starting to close some plants, and they've even experienced worker deaths from the coronavirus. Tyson, the same way. Tyson has announced a handful of plant closures, and they have also experienced a number of worker deaths. Smithfield just announced that they closed their Sioux Falls, South Dakota pork plant. Sanderson Farms, one of the largest poultry vertically integrated companies, has seen significant issues in being able to operate their plants. Maple Leaf, and then JBS, Marfrig, and Minerva in Brazil has suspended some of their operations because of COVID-19. So what has been the response from a lot of these large protein companies? What are they putting out on their websites? What is the information that they're putting out there for consumers? Well, primarily, if you take a look at their websites and you take a look at their marketing information, promo information, and all of that, 90+% of what they're talking about is informing consumers about how they're treating their employees and their producer suppliers during this time. They're not really doing a fabulous job of informing their consumers about how they can get food. And what many of these large protein companies are doing right now is they're trying to offer an increased price, albeit still well below what we should be getting at this point in time, an increased price for livestock and short-term wage increases for their employees. Now, how will these increases affect the future of these companies? Now, obviously, these companies want these increases in wages and prices to be temporary, but yet producers and the employees in these companies, and oh, by the way, the employees that are represented, by unions and those types of things, those unions are going to now be lobbying for these short-term intended wage increases to be permanent. So these companies are going to be facing that once the COVID-19 pandemic is over. How will they choose, as large protein companies, to adapt to what is going to be a new landscape? And oh, by the way, what's going to happen when everybody's home freezers are full? Everybody is fully stocked up. What happens then? And how will consumer attitudes and perceptions be altered? And I think the question is not, will consumers be more demanding? I think it's pretty definitive. They are now going to be more demanding. They know more. They fear more. And that has ultimately changed the way they view the world, and particularly the food world. And this is going to be particularly evident in the younger generations. I'm a member of the baby boomer generation, so I guess I'm in that older generation now. But as we look at the younger generations, millennials, Generation X, so on and so forth, this is permanently altering the way they're going to look at things and the way they're going to buy food for the rest of their life. Now let's look at the restaurant impact. What has happened there? Well, sales across all of the different restaurant sectors, fine dining, fast casual, QSR, and QSR stands for quick service restaurants, which means fast food restaurants, the McDonald's, the Chick-fil-A's, the Hardee's, and Burger King's of the world. Across every restaurant sector combined, their sales have fallen by an aggregated average of 40% and are continuing to fall. That's what we know this week. Restaurants in all 50 U.S. states, including Alaska and Hawaii, have been significantly impacted. Now, it's not just the restaurants that have been impacted. We got to understand that there's companies that service these restaurants. So the people that are also being impacted, the companies that are being impacted, are food distributors that service these restaurants in the institutional food service. And in two ways. First of all, those food distributors are not getting the orders that they were getting prior. And many of these restaurants have not been able to pay those distributors what they already owed them before the shutdown started. So the distributors are hurting. They're suffering as well. If we look at dine-in full-service restaurants, what we typically call a fine dining restaurant, their sales have declined by a little better than 72% and are continuing to decline. And many have chosen to just simply close their doors during the pandemic because they cannot adequately and profitably do takeout. So they just opted to close their doors. Now, the huge question here with the restaurants, particularly the fine dining sector, is how many are going to be able to open their doors back up after this is all over. It's been estimated that as many as 50 to 60%, hopefully not, but as many as 50 to 60% may not be able to open their doors back up after restaurants are allowed to have dine-in customers again. If we look at the quick service restaurant sector, all the fast food folks, their sales have dropped more than 35%. Now, obviously, they were already equipped for drive-through service and that type of thing. And now, presently, more than 90% of all the QSR restaurant sales are coming from their drive-through. And McDonald's just announced today that their sales globally, global sales, have fallen 22%. So that's been a very, very hard hit for them. So what can restaurants do? Well, there's a number of things. They can consider doing meal kits and whole meal replacements with cooking instructions. Now, 50, 60, 80 years ago, 100 years ago, that would have seemed ridiculous. Really? Meal kits, home meal replacements? And the most ridiculous part about that, cooking instructions? You know, decades ago, almost everybody knew how to cook. Today, it's amazing how many people do not know how to cook beyond heat and eat, microwave, that type of thing. So today, they actually need cooking instructions. Another thing that these restaurants can do and are doing is reduce and streamline their menus. If you're going to do takeout and people are going to order online or whatever, call up and order, drop by, you bring it out to their vehicles, you need to greatly simplify their process of being able to do that. And that means streamlining menus. Don't have near as many menu options, and don't make it so complicated. As a matter of fact, more complicated menus in this time would mean far less opportunity for that restaurant to be profitable and viable. Another thing that they can do is look at items that may be sold at a lower price due to the economic impact on households. So, and we're seeing this right now, and I'll talk about this a little more in a moment. We're seeing this in the fact that using beef as an example, the middle meats, for one of the first times I can remember in my lifetime, are getting harder and harder to move. Middle meats used to be the easiest thing out of an entire beef carcass to move, and were up until just a couple of months ago. But now the middle meats are getting harder to move because they're the highest priced item out of a beef carcass. Restaurants can identify meal needs in their community and work to meet those needs. And they can compete for the grocery segment. And a number of restaurants are doing precisely that today. They have basically turned their square footage in their restaurant into grocery stores. And they're actively selling groceries to the consumer. And I added this other one in here, as an enticement. Well, offer the consumer a roll of toilet paper with every order. So what's selling? Well, if we look at beef sales year over year, and year over year means this year to date, January to now, compared to January to this April in 2019. So if we look at year over year sales, beef sales overall have increased 91% year over year. That's never happened in my lifetime, ever, in a single year over year, not even close to that. As a matter of fact, if you see single digit increases, that's generally viewed in the beef industry as being very good on a year over year basis. Hamburger is up an amazing 104% year over year. And as I alluded to earlier, the middle meats are getting harder to sell, and that's predominantly because of dine-in restaurants and institutional food service being shut down. All other proteins are up, and I'm going to show you some data from that on the next slide. Deli meat sales are up 77%, and as is obvious, far more people are eating at home. Restaurant sales have dropped significantly. Even takeout and drive-through continue to diminish. In other words, people are getting tired of takeout and drive-through. And believe it or not, they're actually getting tired of eating fast food every day, meal after meal. So we're going to continue, as long as this goes on and the shutdown continues, we're going to continue to see a further diminishing of takeout and drive-through business and sales. However, in direct contrast, direct market sales by farmers and ranchers and smaller branded programs have increased exponentially. And I'm going to show you some numbers for that in just a second. So let's look at the broader industry and what our year-over-year differences are between 2019 and this point, 2020. As I said earlier, ground beef sales are up 104%, ground turkey 87%, ground chicken 69%, ground pork up 89%, ground lamb up 33%. And for lamb, that's an amazing increase, and that could have a very meaningful impact in the future for the growth of the lamb industry and consumer desire for lamb products. Fresh turkey sales are up 126%. Bison sales, particularly ground bison, are up 123%. And pork sales are up 101%. So what's happening is people are starting to distrust the centralized food system, and they're not certain it can deliver. They're discovering local and regional foods and markets. That's where we come in. A lot of you on the line tonight, a lot of you watching this webinar have delved into direct marketing. You may be a part of a branded program. The majority of direct marketers and branded programs around the US over the last month have seen their sales increase between 350% and more than 1,000%. Many have sold as much product in a month as they normally do in an entire year or even longer. Now, actually, I want to go back to one thing. If we go up to this slide where we look at year-over-year differences in a lot of these proteins, what are consumers not buying near as much of that they were just 3 months ago? And just 3 months ago was all in the news. And just 3 months ago were touting themselves as an enormous threat to the real protein sector. Well, it's the plant-based alternatives. Consumers have made it very clear that in a time of challenge, a time of pandemic, they are opting for the real deal rather than the plant-based alternatives. They're voting with this with their buying dollar, and you can, again, if you look at this slide again, you can see the difference. So the same thing has happened with the alternative products in dairy. We're seeing consumers scrambling to buy real dairy products. But again, I know that's totally contrary to the fact that a lot of large dairies are dumping milk, as I said earlier. So we've got a lot of conundrums going on here. So many who are benefiting in being able to sell food today are those who can supply consumers within a 50 to 100 mile radius of where they're located, either their branded program or their farms. They can quickly load up product and get it to where the people are in an hour or less. Others that are benefiting are those that have robust internet sales. So a lot of the direct marketers that have well-established internet sales have seen their sales increase by several 100%. And I love this quote by Judith Swartz. She wrote an article here just a week or so ago talking about the pandemic and its impact on the food sector as a whole. And in that article, Judith says, those farmers and local vendors that know their customers and can anticipate and respond to their evolving needs much quicker, or can do that much quicker than a globalized supply chain allows. She's absolutely right, and that's what we're talking about tonight. But we have our own bottlenecks, and we're starting to discover those right now. So many of us that have been experiencing several hundred to over 1,000% increase in sales and are now scrambling to get product processed and back in our hands so we can put it in the hands of the consumer. We have bottlenecks in local and regional processing, especially USDA inspected. You know, over the last several decades, because of the advent and the creation of the centralized food system, that caused many smaller processors to go out of business. And now more than ever, we need those smaller local processors. We need far greater capacity for fabricating and further fabricating of protein products, capacity for processing of produce products, fruits and vegetables. We need greater cold storage to be able to handle these products if we're doing local and regional food production. We need better delivery mechanisms and better aggregation mechanisms than what we currently have. And we need better pipeline planning. You know, everybody planned their pipeline, obviously based on pre-2020 sales and what they anticipated a normal year to be. So we've got to change those anticipations. So how do we better get food to people? E-commerce and internet marketing is certainly one way, and many consumers are turning more and more to this way of buying food. They were already doing that through Amazon, through Kroger, through a number of other entities, Walmart and so forth. We're training people to buy over the internet, buy the groceries over the internet. But now they're really flocking to the internet to try to purchase food over the internet. Drop shipping after those purchases, CSA type delivery with pickup locations and times. And we have to remember, and we'll talk a lot more about this particular point and how to effectively do internet marketing and so forth on our next webinar when we're laying the foundation. But social media influence is very important, and it must be well conceived and well delivered. Poorly delivered social media can do a lot more harm than good. And again, in our next webinar, marketing webinar, we'll talk a lot more about that. So again, as I said, some restaurants have become grocery stores. Some of the food distributors, what have they done? Well, they've started home food delivery and dry goods service delivery to these homes. They're doing parking lot sales, and they're doing pickup points for direct to consumers. So many of these food distributors that have never marketed direct to the consumer, that have always marketed to institutional food service and to restaurants, are now totally reinventing their business and are now marketing direct to the consumer. Now, here's the good thing in that for many of us who are practicing regenerative production and have already started or delved into direct marketing or branded food marketing. These food distributors are buying more of our products rather than the commodity produced products. Because if they're going to do straight to home delivery, they want to do it with a higher quality product. And that's precisely what we're seeing happen today. Restaurants, branded programs, direct marketers, and distributors are setting up drive-through parking lot sales. You know, we're doing it at Joyce Farms. In a single weekend, a Friday and a Saturday, we serviced more than 2,000 customers on a drive-through basis. So it's amazing what can happen. So what do people need, both now and tomorrow? Well, first and foremost, especially now, they need nutrient-dense food. And honestly, much to my chagrin, when I see these incredibly long lines at all the QSR restaurants, you know, I sort of bite my tongue, because that's the food you don't need right now. We need very healthy, whole foods, nutrient-dense foods at this time to keep our bodies as healthy as possible when we're being exposed to this COVID-19 threat. But unfortunately, we're seeing more and more people rely on fast food at this point in time. People need safe food. And in spite of what is often said, and yes, we have the data to prove it, many of these locally produced foods that are direct marketed are actually, from a pathogen standpoint, a lot safer than the mass-produced foods. Consumers need and want more variety. That is becoming more and more evident, and they're telling us that with their buying dollar. They want transparency and trust. They want to know that what we're telling them is the truth, and they're tired of label deception. They're actually getting very tired of that. And we see this, one of the top 5 things that consumers say, and this has been happening for more than 10 years now on consumer surveys looking at food. One of the top 5 things that shows up on many of these surveys is label claim deception. They feel like there's a lot of label claim deception. And in the beef industry, one of those is a little label claim called Product of the USA. Product of USA on a label is a guarantee that that's an imported beef product, not a domestically produced product. If it was domestically produced, they don't put Product of the USA. You would put born and raised in the USA, something like that. But when you see Product of USA, you can rest assured it's an imported product that passed through a USDA processing plant before it went to the consumer. They don't want gimmicks. They're tired of marketing gimmicks. Again, transparency and trust. And they want ready access to food, even in challenging times. So these are the things that they're looking for. And they've told us this on survey after survey after survey. And for those of us that deal daily directly with the consumer, this is what we hear over and over. So how can we, every one of us that is on this webinar tonight, how can we take advantage and provide consumers with what they need? Well, first and foremost, we need robust local and regional food systems that are backed by the global market, as opposed to the global being the first go-to. Now, am I saying we don't need the large food companies? No, I'm not saying that at all. But what I'm saying is we need the proper balance between the two, between local and regional food systems and the more global, national and global food systems. And as we said earlier, the U.S. already has significant overproduction of corn, soybeans, and wheat. You know, the USDA last week put out planting intentions for the U.S. And when they asked farmers why they were planting corn this year, a little better than 75% of them said, well, because that's just part of my normal rotation. They had no better explanation for why they were going to plant corn this year. Just a part of my rotation. Folks, that's not working very well for us. We got to be a lot smarter than that in what we do in our decision-making process. It can't be just because. One of the things we have to realize is that we export a lot, especially of our corn, soybeans, and wheat. We export a lot of this abroad to be processed cheaply and then returned to the U.S. in packaged goods that fill the middle aisles of our grocery stores. And the reason that this global food sector wants our corn and soybeans and wheat to be cheap is because of what's happening in point 3. Exportation to be processed cheaply and returned back to the U.S. as packaged goods. So what we have to do here is we have to shift from a philosophy of feeding global trade to feeding people. And what we're starting to see right now is some countries are already starting to stockpile food reserves, and they're even halting their exports of food products. So that's going to mean that we have to think about reducing our dependence on global trade at this point in time and feeding our population. So again, how can we take advantage of this and provide consumers with what they need? Well, as small and mid-sized producers and branded programs and processors, we got to be agile, flexible. And we can do that far more easily than the big companies can and the big processors can. We can respond to shifts in demand and need much more easily. And again, another quote from Judith Schwartz here in a recent article, and I really love this one, and nothing could be truer. Growing food is ultimately a matter of biology, not technology. A secure food program must consider how nature works. So finally, we also have some emerging research. And what we're seeing here is an absolute game changer. Utilizing mass spectrometry, we can determine metabolomics in food. In other words, we can identify specific spectrum metabolites in food. And mass spectrometry can identify now more than 2,000 different metabolites in food. And these metabolites comprise the nutrition of that food product and are made up of things like vitamins and minerals and phenolics and nucleotides and amino acids and fatty acids and xenobiotics and all of those types of things. A lot of big words in there, I know. But bottom line is it all amounts to the nutrition that goes into your body. So what we're doing is we're teaming up with a team of scientists from several different places, and the majority of this research is being physically conducted at Duke University School of Medicine in the Research Triangle there in North Carolina. And an initial analysis that is very, very interesting and very compelling that I want to share with you tonight. And we're going to have a lot more data coming down the road on this, but initial analysis comparing a plant-based hamburger to a grass-fed beef hamburger revealed that there was an 87% biochemical difference between the two. Now, what does that mean? That means very simply that the grass-fed beef hamburger had 87% more nutrients. It was 87% more nutrient dense than the plant-based hamburger. Folks, if that doesn't wake us up, I don't know what does. And again, as this data becomes available to the consumer, as we get a little further down the road and do a lot more, this analysis is very, very expensive So it takes a lot of fundraising to do this, but it's incredibly revealing and incredibly valuable. And as we get further down the road and reveal more and more of these differences in commodity foods versus regeneratively produced foods and so on and so forth, this is going to have a huge impact on buying habits with the consumer. This will not be able to be dismissed by anybody, and the consumer will sit up and pay attention to this. So I'm going to stop there tonight and remind you that on April the 14th at 7:30 p.m., we have a second marketing webinar called Laying the Foundation. And in that webinar, Gabe and Shane and I are going to delve into how can you lay the foundation for a successful marketing program of your own. So Shane, thank you, and we'll open it up to questions now.
Well, thank you, Alan. I mean, what a phenomenal presentation and information, and putting all that together and sharing that this evening. You know, a question we did have that came through was, what are the middle cuts they were wanting to know you were referring to?
Sure. Middle meats are your loin cuts. So on a beef carcass, that would be ribeyes. It would be filet mignon. It would be sirloins, or T-bones and porterhouses, or New York strips, depending on how you fabricate that short loin. In a pork carcass, that will be the pork tenderloin and pork chops, that type of thing. So those are the cuts that are being most adversely impacted and affected in terms of sales, because they are the most expensive cuts.
Thank you, Alan. Another question is, how would a conventional producer get started into, you know, going into a regenerative type direct marketing approach?
Well, I'll give you a brief response to that tonight, and Gabe and Shane, y'all can respond as well. But what I will say is that we'll delve much deeper into that question at the next webinar, the Laying the Foundation webinar. But first and foremost, just like how do you start your journey into regenerative agriculture, how do you start your journey into marketing? You start it with education. Just the very thing that you're doing tonight, you're starting to educate yourself on marketing. That's critical. You cannot do and implement what you do not know. So you have to take advantage of educational opportunities like these to be able to learn the things that you don't know, and to learn how to set up a proper marketing program, how to effect and implement that marketing program, and even more importantly, quite frankly, how to avoid what I call the common mistakes. I've been doing this for 30 years now or so, and I had a presentation that I used to do quite frequently that I called, you know, the nails in the coffin presentation. And as you study the mistakes that a lot of people make when they're starting a branded program or they're starting to direct market, what you find is that almost everybody repeats the same darn mistakes. They are not studying, they're not educating themselves, they're not looking at why others before them failed. They just somehow think, oh, I'm going to be the one to succeed. And so they fail to study why others before them failed. And they repeat the exact same mistakes. So that's one of the most important things you can learn, is not repeating the same mistakes and not trying to reinvent the wheel. If the wheel works, don't reinvent it.
Great point, sir, Alan. We have another question here asking, can the metabolomics be looked at longitudinally to create a deeper story of ag practices?
I think absolutely. Absolutely, they can.
Here's another question, and we know the partners are on this tonight, and so are several of our consultants. But will we see people move back to the country because of job loss and for food security? What's your thoughts, Alan?
That's a very good question, and I've actually been asked that quite a few times over the last 3 weeks. I think we'll certainly see some of that, no doubt. And, people are going to be concerned about, I need at least a little piece of land, so if I have to grow my own food, I can, or I can go hunting and fishing, and get some of my own protein. So I think we will see some of that. However, what we have to realize is that there's still a large percentage of our population, and particularly in the younger generations, that, they're still going to be a little averse to that because, frankly, they wouldn't know what to do with that piece of land if they had it.
Gabe, would you like to chime in on that question or your thoughts?
I think Ellen pretty well summed that up. I really think that this gets down to, we often wonder and seem overwhelmed starting out, those of us who have gone down the direct marketing path. And it's something I certainly agree with Alan. You just do not want to jump in without educating yourself first. Education is key. And then I would strongly advise that you move into it slowly. And for instance, rather than, and I'll just use grass finished beef for an example, rather than trying to market that grass finished beef directly yourself starting out, maybe align yourself with a producer or operator who is established and learn from them. And then as you get more confident in your abilities to raise grass finished beef, as you advance the soil health and the regenerative, as you're able to regenerate your soils and get higher bricks contents in the plants, and then it'll carry on to the animals, you become more confident, then you start slowly moving down the path. Don't jump into it all at once. You have to learn first, and you got to learn to crawl before you walk, so to speak.
Thank you, Gabe. Here's a pretty lengthy question, but it's pretty relevant, and I'm going to try to paraphrase it here. Basically, small restaurants, more like your mom and pop operations, have a limited footprint, due to the real estate expense, and too often the questions asking here, they are very price sensitive when buying products, so they're basically forced to buy into the commodity market. I mean, what's your thoughts and feel, Alan? I mean, how does some of these restaurants take advantage, per se, of, saying that they're buying more direct from local producers and, utilize that, in their marketing campaigns?
Yeah, so I can actually speak directly to that because we work very, very heavily with restaurants, and particularly these independently owned restaurants around the country. And the way that you help them in that regard, everybody's price sensitive. I mean, we got to understand that. But yet at the same time, the consumer has clearly indicated that when it comes down to buying food, trying to stay healthy and so forth, as evidenced by this rapid move towards buying locally and regionally right now, they're going to choose the best foods that they can choose when they're buying like that, and what they perceive to be the most nutrient dense as well. So the way that you approach that with restaurants, is that you've got to become more than just a salesperson. You can't, and we'll talk a lot more about this next week and lay in the foundation. But what you have to do is you have to help them understand how to do whole carcass utilization, because that greatly cheapens up the price of that grass-fed beef or that pastured pork or that pastured lamb. And you have to help them understand how to use all of that in their menu to be far more creative. And you can do it. And next week, we'll talk much more in detail about how you do that, okay? And what are some of the ideas that you can implement to be very creative with your restaurants. But you've got to train, you've got to help them in developing their menus. You've got to train the chef staff, the cooking staff. You've got to train the wait staff. And you have to remember that in these dine-in restaurants, the wait staff are your direct salespeople. It's not the chefs. The chefs aren't out there selling the patrons in the restaurant. It's the wait staff. And if the wait staff don't know, then they can't adequately sell these products to the consumer. Every time I go in a restaurant that advertises that they are farm to table or locally sourced or anything like that, the very first thing that I do is I look at the offering on the menu to see what that says. And oftentimes, what they have on the menu and the way they describe it is their first failure, okay? It doesn't give me any indication of what your farm to table products are or your local products are. You're not telling me much at all, so you're not informing me as your customer. Secondly, I'll ask the wait staff, okay, what are your locally sourced products? And they'll point out something, but then I say, okay, where's it from? And can you tell me how it's produced? They look at me with this dumbfounded look on their faces like, ooh, I wish you hadn't asked that question. And they'll fumble around a little bit, and then they'll say, I have to go back into the kitchen and ask the owner or the chef. You know, folks, that doesn't work at all. And if we're selling to a restaurant, the truth of the matter is that's partially our fault, because our jobs are not done when we make that sale. So I'm going to stop there tonight, Shane, because we're going to delve a lot more into that next week. But my short answer is absolutely many of these dine-in restaurants all over the country will buy our products. We're just not selling them right, and we're not representing them right to those restaurants.
Great points. There's kind of two questions that kind of combine themselves here to an extent. I'm going to ask both and get the feedback from it. The first one is, can rural America develop the local processing to meet the demands? And the other question is, that's similar to this, is how do we overcome the bottleneck of lack of slaughtering facilities?
So I have been in multiple conversations about that very thing over the last 2 weeks. And just today, 3 or 4 telephone conversations and Zoom meetings on that very issue, because many direct marketers and branded programs are facing that very bottleneck right now. And I've been talking with local and regional processors over the past 3 weeks quite heavily. And what we are looking at is strategizing on ways to be able to be very innovative, very inventive, and to rectify as rapidly as possible some of these bottlenecks. We're even, in some of the things that we've talked about, are taking plants that are some of these local and regional plants that are frankly well under capacity, and making better utilization of them, putting in a second shift, and more people to staff those plants to be able to get more throughput through those plants. I've been helping some processors take a look at the design of their flow on their kill floor, their flows through their fabrication floor, and flows through their cold storage, and how we can take existing space and rearrange to make things flow a lot better and a lot quicker. So there are strategies that we can immediately use to be able to help alleviate some of that. And part of that also falls on the producer. We have an obligation to work very closely in partnership with our processors, and we have an obligation to not call them up 2 days before and say, hey, I need a kill slot. You know, we've got to work with them and give them plenty of lead time, and we've got to be a routine customer. You know, it doesn't do a processor a whole lot of good if we only use them once or twice a year. They're not going to be too high on doing you a lot of favors. You know, they're going to go with those that are giving them a lot more and more consistent business. The other thing that we're looking at right now, Shane, and that we've been talking a lot about are what are the opportunities locally and regionally to be able to, within the next 2 to 3 years, rapidly expand this processing capacity. And we've been talking about that not just with meat processing, but we've also been talking about this in terms of dairy processing and produce processing. And there are existing facilities that are either not in use or significantly underutilized at this point in time that we can rapidly put into play. So that's one of the immediate strategies. And of course, the other strategy is to look at investor funding and all of that, which now will be more forthcoming for things like this because of the weaknesses in the centralized food system exposed by COVID-19. We're going to see more investors willing to fund this type of processing capacity.
Thank you, Alan. I mean, great points again. I mean, there's another question here. Are there tests we can have done on our beef to test for nutrient density specific the omegas?
So the short answer to that, if you're talking about omega-3, omega-6, fatty acid profiles, you know, the CLAs, conjugated linoleic acid, polyunsaturated fatty acids, all of those types of things, absolutely. Those tests are readily available. They're not cheap. They're not super expensive, and you don't have to test every animal. If they've all been treated the same way, you know, finished the same way and that type of thing, then what you get out of one animal in a batch that you harvest, you're going to get out of all of them. So, you know, one of the labs that I've used quite frequently through the years is the food analysis lab at Iowa State University. Dr. Don Bites has run that lab for a long time. He and his staff there at Iowa State, they do an absolutely fabulous job. If anybody wants to use that lab and needs contact information, you can contact us at understandingag.com. We'd be happy to get that contact information to you. Oh, by the way, they're also one of the best priced labs out there because they are a public institution university in terms of doing fatty acid analysis. There's others that do it too. You know, Muriel, Silicor, Covance. So there's a number of private labs. And if you're interested in those private labs, I can supply contact information for them as well. So there are several labs across the US that will do fatty acid analysis for you. So you can get it readily done.
Thank you. Here's the next question. And I'm going to take this one first, and I think we all need to kind of chime in on this one. But what is the most common mistake, and I'm assuming the question's asking when it comes to direct marketing, and that's not having a palatable product. And it all goes back to your soil health function, or the functions of your soils and the health of your soils. I mean, one thing I tell people, too often people jump in wanting to direct market and they're finishing animals out on monoculture systems, and they're trying to demand a higher value for that product. And too often, when the consumer spends their money on the product, it's not a very desirable one. It's no different. They could have bought the same product from a chain store for far less, and you're going to lose that customer. So what we have tried to attempt to do is focus on our soil health, get the diversity of plant species out there in order for the animals can regulate what they need, get a high energy diet in those grass finishers, and produce a very palatable product. Alan, your comments?
Well, on that point, Shane, what is the most important thing for a robust, appealing flavor profile? Nutrient density.
Yep.
Nutrient density. And yes, and you get nutrient density from plant species diversity and high levels of microbial activity in the soil, right? That's how you get it. So you're absolutely right. Nutrient density, but I'm going to give you the top 3 things here. Okay, and again, in the next webinar, we'll delve more deeply into this. But the top 3 things are, first of all, lack of studying why others failed in making the same mistakes, the common mistakes that I alluded to earlier. The second is exactly what you just described, Shane. You know, a poor quality end product. The third is poor processing. Okay, if it's poorly fabricated, poorly packaged, and all of that, then you're not going to keep a customer. Okay, so you got to have good processing as well.
Great point, great points. Gabe, would you like to interject anything, or anyone else?
I will just concur with what both you and Alan said, and tying that into the previous question about testing. We have been doing quite a bit of testing lately, not only of our own products, but we've tested also regional pastured proteins that are in the same market as we are, and quote unquote conventionally raised pastured proteins. And we send all these in for nutrient analysis. Then we have the comparison, because we are getting asked more and more by consumers, well, you talk about omega 6:3 ratios, what are yours? Well, here, we will not only show you what ours are, but we will show you what other leading brands are and what the conventional is, and then compare. And that ties exactly into what both you said, Shane, and Alan said. It's the diversity. Way too many producers they have grass-fed animals that they are attempting to sell as grass-finished. And there's a big difference. And those grass-fed animals are being finished on pastures that have very low diversity. And one of the issues I will add to that, these animals are being finished on either pastures or on haylage that is way too high in protein. And that's throwing off the flavor considerably. It'll give you that kind of dirty penny or minerally like flavor in the meats. That's very, very common mistake for people who are just moving down the pastured protein path.
Thank you, Gabe. Anybody else would like to make any comments? I know we have several consultants on.
Shane, I would also mention there also needs to be a lot of education to the consumer as well, especially on grass finished, on how to cook and prepare that product. So, you know, even if you had a weekend or an evening course with maybe a local cooking class or something like that to display your products, but also how to prepare that correctly is very beneficial.
Great point there, David. And it's very, very critical preparation. Anyone else like to comment, consultant-wise?
Yeah, Shane, this is Jonathan.
Yeah, Jonathan.
I would say a mistake that a lot of small folks make going into the direct marketing is not understanding your accounting well and counting all of your cost. And so being very careful not to put too much into an animal and not be profitable before you know it, because you're already paying a considerably higher amount of money for your processing, and you're behind the 8 ball in your pricing with competitors of larger size. And so if you've pumped a lot of money in to that animal by having to keep them longer because you don't have the forage chain, like Gabe said, being ready for and having your soil healthy, then you're going to find yourself spending more by having to put a lot more into that animal to get it to a quality finish.
Shane, this
Yeah,
is
Gabe.
Gabe. I will just mention also to go right, and Jonathan's exactly right. That's one of the most common mistakes. I know Alan will certainly agree with that, that a lot of beginners make is they don't know their true costs, and they do not take all of their costs into account. We see that over and over again. We're going to talk more about this on the next webinar, but hand in hand with that is they try and compete price-wise with the conventional market. And that is a major mistake. You are selling a quality product. You should not be competing price-wise with the conventional market. You know, not everybody can afford a Cadillac, I always say. People will pay for quality. And you know, we often hear people saying, yeah, but we need everybody to be able to afford this. Well, what are healthcare costs for the average family? If you truly care about your health, you better be willing to spend more on food. So that gets into education also, but it's a real mistake. People do not know their costs of production, and they price their products way too low.
No, great points there, Gabe and Jonathan, both. Absolutely. Anyone else like to make a comment here before we move on?
Shane, Kent here.
Yeah, Kent.
One quick one, and it's a little bit of a summary of what's been discussed, but know your customer. What do they want? Alan had slides earlier on how the market is shift from middle meats to ground meat. That's just an example of knowing your customer. How do they want it packaged? What do they want it to look like? What are their tastes? What are they interested in? When do they want it? Is it a restaurant? Is it a grocery store? Who is it? But know your customer.
No, all great points there, and I appreciate everyone chiming in on that question. We kind of have another one like that right here. Where are we at 6 months from now from all of this? And I'm going to open it up to whoever would like to remark first on it.
Well, I think first response to that, Shane, is going to depend highly on what's happening with the pandemic, right? As I said earlier, when we were talking about the restaurants, particularly the dine-in restaurants, the longer the shutdown goes on, then the higher the percentage of dine-in restaurants there's going to be that will not be able to open their doors back up. So that's going to make a profound difference on even the ability to go dine out, you know, and to dine out well beyond a fast food type deal. And the honest truth is, almost anybody, if you have to eat too much fast food, you're going to get tired of it pretty quick because it all tastes the same, you know. And sooner or later you're going to want something very, very different than that, and your body is going to be screaming for something very different than that. So we're going to see, definitely already, we know we're going to see a definitive change in the restaurant sector and the institutional food service sector. That, no doubt. We're going to see a definitive change in a lot of the distribution sector because of this as well already. You know, it will not be the same as it was just 2 and 3 months ago. And 6 months from now, particularly if this goes on another 2 to 3 months, that's just going to drive home even more to the consumer themselves as individuals, their need to rely on a very different type of food system like we've talked about tonight, and to eat healthier foods. So I think we've already seen the shift, guys. It's not a matter of will this shift occur. It's already occurred. It's just a matter of how deeply it's going to take hold and how rapidly it's going to grow. And so our thinking has to be visioning forward. You know, it's like Wayne Gretzky used to say, right? Skate to where the puck is going to be, not where it is now. That's what we need to be doing. We're going to have to skate to where the puck's going to be. And so we're going to have to do a little bit of visioning for that. And we've given you a lot of foundation tonight to do that visioning. So, you know, Shane, we're going to have to think very differently. And we're going to have to realize the consumer population is going to be very different 6 months from now, and their perceptions, their desires, their demands. But the beautiful thing is that if we do our job right of representing our product, knowing our story, knowing how to tell that story, then we're in the best position we've ever been in our lifetimes, ever, to be
Well, I
able
couldn't
to
agree more,
market
Alan.
to that customer.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, like you said, communicate your story, but, you know, I'm going to share with the audience one thing you taught me, you know, let them taste it. You know,
Yep.
Provide free sampling and let the consumer taste your product. You know, when we first started down this path, we were trying to tell what we were doing and trying to sell our product. And we had far much greater success once we allowed them to sample and taste the difference. And that was a huge, huge part of helping us, you know, start building our direct marketing. Anyone else like to comment on this question about where do you feel we'll be at 6 months?
Shane, I will. This is Gabe.
Yeah, Gabe.
About 6 months ago in my presentations, I started on direct marketing. I started explaining to people that the food industry had studied and projected that by the year 2025, they were predicting 25% of the groceries purchased in the United States would be shipped directly to people's doors. Okay. Now look at how that has already changed. Here we are, of April 2020. I'm sure we've flown by that already. Okay. So it's changed significantly, and that's not going to go back. People, they like the convenience of being able to shop at home. And I see that as a real opportunity for those who want to direct market. You know, here I am living in North Dakota. Okay. We're out in the middle. Most people think of nowhere, you know, igloos and Eskimos. We can ship to any door in North Dakota for a guaranteed price of $15 a box or less. If we ship into the major cities in North Dakota, if there is such a thing, it's $10 to do that. So people think, oh, I can't do that. I don't live near a large metropolitan area. We can do it in North Dakota. It can be done anywhere. That is going to be huge. As Ellen said, you have to look at this as an opportunity. Yes, we don't want to belittle the fact of what's taken place in this pandemic and the death and the suffering. But in saying that, we have to be willing to change, just as Ellen started this presentation out with. Guys, look at this as an opportunity. Don't be afraid of it, and be willing to change, because it's for the betterment of not only you, but the people who are going to consume your products.
Thank you, Gabe. Anyone else like to chime in on that question? If not, we're going to kind of keep moving on here and try to get finished up. Here's another good question. Where should we look to find how others have failed? Well, go to our website, because that's how we learn, is by failing. Or at least that's how I have learned. And I think, Gabe, you probably share the same sentiment. And I'm sure Alan does, and everyone else listening.
That's exactly right, Shane. What you want to do is don't be afraid to reach out to those who are established and in the business. One of the things we're most proud of in this regenerative agriculture movement is the willingness of people to share. And I can literally pick up the phone and call people in every single state and in every country who are in regenerative agriculture, and they're willing to share. So that's how you learn. Simply pick up the phone and call people. You know, my old friend Neil Dennis was known for that. He would pick up the phone and call anybody. And that's how friendships develop, and that's how you learn. Don't be afraid to do so.
Absolutely. Anyone else like to comment on that one? But Gabe said it right there. That's probably one of the most appealing things with people inside of regenerative agriculture is the willingness to share, and you know, they're willing to admit the, you know, where they have failed and mistakes they have made, and to alleviate that from you falling in those same traps or you know, same failures as you progress forward. This is more of a comment than a question from Rickson. We are so thankful that you partners and consultants have been willing to give so much of your time and resources over many years to lay the foundation for those of us who are following. I can only imagine the frustration and disappointment when so few were willing to listen just a few years ago. Thanks, guys. Gabe, would you like to comment or say anything?
Well, Rickson, thank you very much. And yes, those of us who have been in it a long time, Alan will share this sentiment. At times we thought we were talking to a brick wall, but it's really changed, and people are listening, and it brings joy to us. And I will just say this, Rickson, we've learned as much from you as you've learned from us, and same with all of you who have attended a Soil Health Academy or are our clients, and we just are learning all the time, and it's a group effort. We're all in this together.
Second,
yeah, we appreciate. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, just second that. Amen.
Absolutely. We appreciate everything you've done also, Rickson. Ruth has a question here. You didn't mention additional challenges with accessing labor. Is this not a challenge for farmers and processors in the U.S.? And I'm going to take this just a little bit. We've got a blog that will be coming out here relatively soon addressing this question. You know, we have a lot of young people in this country that are needing some skilled labor. I mean, they're needing to pay for college or an after school job to utilize. And as Alan mentioned, you know, some of these processors are needing to look into a second shift. And that's where a labor force like that could be very well utilized and stuff. So anyone else like to make a comment about that, about the labor for farmers and processors?
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that, Shane. On the farming side, what we're finding is that there actually are sufficient numbers of young people and even middle-aged people that are willing to do that type of work. They want to be paid decently for it. Okay, so it means we can't pay a minimum wage. You know, many farms throughout the U.S. are paying minimum wage or just barely above. And you know, you're not going to get very good people when you do that most of the time, and they're not going to be very loyal. So if you pay them well, and what we have found is we can absolutely do that when we're in a lot of the things that we're going to talk about next week. We'll show you how we're able to pay people better. So if you're able to pay them better, you give them meaningful work, and they have an opportunity to buy in and to grow themselves on your farm, then it's far easier to find the right kind of person. I'm partners also in Joyce Farms, and you know, I can tell you that, you know, in our processing plant for Joyce Farms, we have our own USDA processing plant there in North Carolina, and the vast majority of the employees at that processing plant, because they're paid quite a bit more than, the bigger processing plants will pay them, are very loyal. And many of them have been there a long time. And therefore, they know their jobs very well. They do their jobs very well. So, loyalty works. Paying them well works. Giving them incentives works. Giving them meaning to their work is really what it's all about. And if we do that, they'll be there. They'll be there. We can get the right people, but we have to ante up, in all of those ways to make sure that we can get the right people.
Absolutely. Anyone else would like to comment on that?
Shane, I'll just say a few things. I certainly agree with Alan. There really is not a shortage of people, young and middle age and older, who want to work on regenerative farms. I mean, we're inundated with requests every year for people who want to come work on Brown's Ranch. The thing about it is, though, Alan's absolutely correct. You need to pay them a fair and honest wage. And the issue that there is in conventional agriculture is the profit is not there to do so. I was just doing some research last night that showed the average profitability nationwide on corn last year was $3 an acre. You're not going to hire much labor for that. So regenerative ag and knowing your cost of production and being able to market is going to allow you to pay a higher wage. I'd like to say one other thing, as part owners of a small processing plant, Ruth is correct. The number one challenge we have at that small processing plant is finding skilled labor. That's number one challenge. And part of the reason for that goes back to what Shane said. I really believe that we're pushing, so to speak, college on too many of these young people. Let's be honest, a lot of young people would make way more money, and they would do a better job if they went to trade schools instead, or become apprentices in programs like learning how to be a meat cutter, for example. That would be a way better education for them than what we're pushing on them now.
No, great remarks, Gabe and Alan. Anyone else like to address that question? We're going to try to get it wrapped up here. We got one or two more we're going to ask. What is the estimated cost of putting up a USDA inspection locker plant? Alan?
Wow. That's one of those questions where the first answer is it depends, and it really, really does. So what's the square footage? What's the capacity? What's the throughput? All of that plays a huge role. What I'll say is this: if you're building one from the ground up, even a small plant, typically you're looking at $1 million plus, okay, by the time everything is all said and done. But that being said, there's a lot of plants out there that have been shut down, shuttered, that you can buy for pennies on the dollar. And that's one of the things I often help people do is in our consulting is we'll go and actually evaluate a plant that is sitting there, an existing one that nobody's operating and that's for sale, and determine what can you offer for that plant. And here's the dirty little secret about a processing plant is that it's often the third owner before you make money in that plant, because the first one spends way too much on capital investment and getting it started operating and all of that usually. You can usually buy it for under 30 cents on the dollar, even a year or two later, guys, right? After it was opened as brand new. And I've seen that happen. I've got dozens and dozens of incidences like that I can cite to you. So your better bet is to go buy an existing facility for pennies on the dollar and then spend most of your investment dollars renovating that, getting it up to USDA regs and specs. And then you have dollars left to actually pay a payroll initially and pay those upfront startup costs to get it going. Many times building a brand new plant, you spent all your money just building the plant and you don't have anything left to operate it. And that's one of the biggest mistakes that most people make with building a processing plant. And that's why you see a lot of them shutting down within 6 months to 2 years of first opening their doors. So try to buy an existing plant for pennies on the dollar. And again, if anybody out there is thinking about that, we can help you do a fair value assessment and determine what you really need to offer on that plant.
Thank you. Gabe, would you like-
Okay, Shane, I got to step in and because Alan, he's telling the exact truth here. Because when we decided to do a fundraiser and build the plant here in North Dakota, Alan told me exactly that. Gabe, try and buy one pennies on the dollar. And at that time, unfortunately, I didn't know Alan as well as I do now. And we did not listen. And we spent $2.2 million to build the plant. We bought the plant with money that was raised. We didn't have to borrow any money to build the plant. But in saying that, it's way too small. If you cannot kill a potload of cattle a day, your plant is way too small and chances of success are minimal. That takes a pretty good sized plant to kill a potload of cattle a day, but you need that economies of scale in order to really make it pay. Would you not agree, Alan?
Absolutely. Yeah, totally agree.
Anyone else like to comment before we move to the last question for the night? All right. Are a majority of the direct marketers processing their own beef, or are they bringing their animals to an established butcher processor? I see that as being a large hurdle on direct marketing. And I think we're going to address a lot of that on next Tuesday's meeting about state regulations and federal regulations. Would you like to add any more to that?
Yeah, yes. So the short answer is yes. The vast majority of direct marketers, they don't own their own processing, and neither should they. They're having to take their animals to a processor somewhere. Again, we'll talk a lot more about this next week, but the one thing that I will tell you is it is worth every penny to drive further if you need to get the right processor than to try to use the one that's closest to you if they will not do what you need done and will not do it well. Bottom line, do not fool around with don't let the processor tell you how to fabricate your animal. You need to know how to fabricate it, and you need to dictate that, and you need to know what good processing and fabrication is, and what good end product looks like. So again, as I said much earlier, educating yourself first, even on this aspect of it, is really pretty critical.
Shane, I have to add something, not to prolong this webinar, but Alan just said something there that I can't stress and agree with enough. Our own kill plant, which we're part owners of, we cannot get the skilled labor there to do the job fabricating that we need done to deliver a quality product to our customers. Rather than haul our beef 90 miles, we're getting our beef fabricated in Northeast Missouri now. We're shipping the animals all the way to Nebraska, having them killed there, cut into primals, shipped over to Northeast Missouri, getting it fabricated there, shipped back to North Dakota. I can do that cost. I can kill in my own plant 90 miles away because I can kill load lots and I can get it cut to specs, fabricated to specs. And the difference, I can't even begin to describe. Alan's 100% correct in those comments.
Well, anyone else like to make a comment on that subject before we end it this evening? Well, seeing none, I really want to greatly thank Dr. Williams for a fabulous presentation and very practical subject matter that's very relevant at this point in time. You know, as the partners and the consultants, we'd like to thank you again for attending. Don't forget next week, another marketing webinar Tuesday, starting at 7:30. You can go to Understanding Ag's website to see the dates and times. We also have one Thursday dealing with more regards to soil and cover crops. I want to say a special thank you to Kathy Richburg. Without her organization, these events would never happen. So thank everyone for attending this evening. We look forward to seeing you at the next webinar, and feel free to reach out with any questions you might have that maybe did not get answered tonight so we can answer them. And I appreciate, again, everyone have a safe evening, and thank you very much for attending.